So I'd like to open with a speech from Winston Churchill, his book, Never Give In. The Navy is strong. We have got to keep it strong. Loud and prolonged cheers. Strong enough, that is, to use for all that it may have to do. And not only strong, but ready. Instantly ready to put forth its greatest strength to the best possible advantage. But here let me say a few words of the utmost plainness. Our naval preparations are necessarily based upon the naval preparations of other powers. It would be affectation, quite a futile kind of affectation, to pretend that the sudden and rapid growth of the German Navy is not the main factor in our determination, whether in regard to expenditure or new construction. To disguise this would be to do less than justice to the extraordinary and prodigious developments which have resulted from German energy and German science in recent years. It would further be foolish to deny the plain truth that naval competition between these two mighty empires, who all the time have such enormous common interests, who all the time have no natural cause for quarrel, it would be foolish to deny that naval competition between them lies at the foot and in the background of almost every difficulty which has baffled the earnest efforts which are repeatedly made, and which the City of London has taken a noble part to arrive at really friendly feelings between the two countries. While that competition continues, every element of distrust and unrest is warm and active, and one evil leads to another in a long and ugly concatenation. We are not so arrogant as to suppose that the blame and the error which follow so often on human footsteps lies wholly on one side, but the maintenance of naval supremacy is our whole foundation. Upon it stands not the empire only, not merely the great commercial prosperity of our people, not merely a fine place in the world's affairs. Upon our naval supremacy stands our lives and the freedom we have guarded for nearly 1,000 years. Next year, the Navy Law, which when completed will give Germany a magnificent and formidable fleet, second only to our own. Next year, the law prescribes that the limit of expansion has been reached and that the annual quota of new ships added to the German Navy will fall to a half the quota of recent years. Hitherto that law, as fixed by Parliament, has not been in any way exceeded, and I gladly bear witness to the fact that the statements of the German ministers about it have been strictly borne out by events. Such is the state of affairs in the world that the mere observance of that law, without an increase, would come to Europe as a great and sensible relief. We should feel that heavy as naval expenditure will undoubtedly be, the high water mark at any rate has been reached, and all over the world men would breathe more freely, and the nations would enter upon a more trustful and more genial climate of opinion. In this we should readily associate ourselves. And if, on the other hand, my Lord Mayor, the already vast programs of other powers for war upon the sea should be swollen by the new and added expansions, that would be a matter of extreme regret to us and other states. But I am bound to say on behalf of His Majesty's government that of all the states and nations of the world, Britain will be found the best able to bear the strain and the last to fail at the call of duty. To cheers. It was called The Maintenance of Naval Supremacy is our whole foundation, given on November 1911 for the outbreak of World War I. I'm responding here this morning to Paul, who had responded to me in Blue Monday, and also saying something in relation to Rupert Morris. And what I'd like to talk about is again the issue of authority, but also the more banal issue of food. In large part because I just revisited a lecture given by Yale historian Timothy Schneider at in 2013. It was a René Girard lecture. I guess he was a student of Girard and gave this lecture on the Holocaust. He's written a book on the same subject. In that lecture, he lays out a pretty powerful explanation of the Holocaust. He laments that the Holocaust has been commemorated but not truly understood. The Hollywood version of the Holocaust, and even the version given in schools, is one of rescue, largely, because that's the kind of story we like to tell. Anyway, he goes on to develop this argument and says that you can't really understand the Holocaust unless you recognize the issue of ecological panic at the heart of it. That the main difference between people in Nazi Germany and people in America wasn't some kind of moral high ground, but it's that people in America had enough to eat and people in Germany didn't. And Hitler took it as axiomatic that there would not be enough food in the future to sustain a growing world population. Which was wrong, because all kinds of scientific advances in irrigation and crossbreeding and so on actually greatly expanded the world's food supply. But he had no way of knowing that, and this was one of the main drivers. So I'm gonna just try to summarize briefly the contents of this lecture, and I'll link it in the description, and try to relate it to what Paul was just saying about authority being strength, and the idea of being a minority of one, and having the right attitude. That basically what Paul seems to be saying is that authority, what I have called authority, is more a question of personal judgment. That we all make judgments, and what I'd like to do is, I agree with that, I think, but what I'd like to do is talk about how individual judgment, how weak it is in the face of institutional collapse. How frail individual morality becomes, because the other side of Timothy Schneider's lecture, on the one hand you have this idea of ecological crisis motivating Hitler, and on the other side, motivating and kind of providing the logic behind how the Holocaust actually happens, is the idea of institutional collapse, the destruction of statehood. Because initially Hitler has the idea that he's going to send the Jews over to Madagascar. And this was an idea floated by the interwar Polish government, and was taken seriously. The Poles wanted to send them there to colonize Africa. Hitler's idea is just to send them over there, get them away, but he's blocked by any kind of deportation by the British Navy. And so what ends up happening is that the Jews end up being killed in this zone of state destruction. This area that Timothy Schneider explains was twice destroyed, because first the Soviets came in, I guess in the 30s, and destroyed it, and tried to make it part of the Soviet Empire. And then the Germans came in and captured all of these Soviets, and in turn the Soviets declared that anyone who had surrendered to the Germans was no longer Soviet. So these people were twice stateless. They'd had their statehood taken away originally, became Soviet, then even their Sovietness was taken away. And these are the people, these Soviet prisoners of war, these are the people who operate the first death camps. So, they're starving. They've had their statehood taken away twice. And that's the kind of mental frame you have to consider when trying to explain the logic of the Holocaust, how it took place. That he says that basically, I don't want to repeat the entire lecture point for points. You can see the link if you're interested. But basically, that the Holocaust was made possible because there were certain fragments of destroyed states which made it possible. So I'm trying to find my footing here of what I'm trying to say and connect this to my previous video. Well, it's, so the idea of food, and I think what I also wanted to talk about was the idea of fasting, and how we take certain things for granted. Because one of the main takeaways from this lecture given by Timothy Schneider is that, we would not act any differently, most likely, under the same circumstances. That the only people who really saved Jews were either diplomats who had some kind of sovereign power they could use to give Jews refuge, or it was mainly fringe religious groups who already felt like they were outsiders from society. But if you were part of the mainstream society, by and large, you would. There were exceptions, but they're very, very few. By and large, you would go along with the current, and no one thought of themselves as taking part in something called the Holocaust. They saw themselves taking part in their own particular life, and we get sucked into that life, So the conversation we've been having has been a little bit looking critically at digital communication, and what it means to be so sucked into your phone that you bump into fence posts and down manholes. I could get in a car accident right now because I'm getting so drunk on the sound of my own voice, and then I would look rather foolish. But at the same time, if you don't have some kind of bearing, some kind of proper orientation with respect to the world outside you, and consider only your self-interest, then you will march in lockstep with the incentive structure of any given standing order of things. I just wanted to touch on the idea of food because I've been interested in fasting, and I've researched it quite a lot, and I've developed a little theory about food. I think that food is one of the most revealing things about a person. If you observe a person's attitude towards food, you almost always get a little synecdoche, a little microcosm of the person themselves. That the person who thinks anybody in your life, whose habits you've observed, and the person who is strict with food is likely strict in their life generally, and vice versa. People who gorge themselves in reality. The act of fasting is such a funny kind of act because it's a very material sort of act on one level, but it's also one of the most spiritual things known to man. There have been various attempts, if you study the history of fasting, and the, sort of the relationship to the scientific community and the medical community. There have been various attempts to popularize fasting as a treatment for illness, for epilepsy, for all these. It's the closest thing known to man that is a true panacea. It can cure pretty much anything. But the issue with it, of course, is that it involves the human will and the human spirit. It can't be taken in pill form, like exercise or anything that is generally salubrious, but can't be taken passively, like a pill or an injection or surgery. So attempts to popularize fasting as a treatment for various illnesses inevitably fall flat because it can't really be administered by anyone other than, it can be given. It could be given a stamp of authority, and if we lived in a more spiritually conscious age, perhaps it would be. I don't know. Perhaps it is. But it's connected with the idea of prayer. That one of the fathers of the church, Saint John Chrysologos, I think his name is, the golden worded Chrysologos, talks about prayer, fasting, and almsgiving as being integral parts of the same thing. You have to be, to fast properly, you have to be in a state of meditation and prayer. So I'm trying to think, what might this mean in relation to the Holocaust and also, the atrocities and deaths in the Soviet era, because that was all connected to famine as well, and to science more generally, and to our attitudes. Hitler was famously a vegetarian, and the Nazis developed decaf coffee. On the eve of their destruction, right before they went into their bunkers and shot themselves in the head, they were at the dinner table discussing dog breeding. There's this very sort of bloodless, stale quality to the Nazi regime in that sense. Contrast that with Winston Churchill, who took a big continental breakfast every morning and a big fat cigar and rubbed his belly. Or with America, cheeseburger in paradise, the land of plenty. This also relates to maybe the question of Israel, which is the land of milk and honey. That a lot of the resentments that build up over time and calcify into these battle lines we draw have a lot to do with those who have and those who have not. And this current situation developing around Iran, and what Rupert Morris and Paul Talk are discussing, that the West is completely dependent upon the U.S. military, and but is sort of lulled into a state of stupor because they've forgotten what it means to want, to be poor. In my personal life, I've spent a good amount of time being unemployed and scraping the bottom of the barrel, and it's not fun, and it's pretty shameful, really, to have a wife and 2 small children and to be unemployed and broke. and to be unshowered, and at times to have your body betray you. That, probably at my worst, I had this rash all over my arms and my legs and my belly, and my bowels were erupting in excruciating pain, and my bank account was overdrawn, and I was sleeping on the floor of my parents' basement, and my children were screaming, And so on an individual level, on my level of being a minority of one, I have experienced that level of want. But on a societal level, I have not. That I live in a prosperous area of the world, relatively speaking. And so, even though my individual state may sink in relation to the world around me is still relatively well off. And so I can only sink so low in an absolute sense. And so, so individually we can consider our own suffering and how we make judgments on an individual level. But on another scale, we are all too susceptible to these large sweeping forces, these horsemen of the apocalypse. Fasting might be a defense against that. Religion, properly ordered, might be a defense against that. But in general, the way is narrow and steep that leads to eternal life, and the way is broad that leads to destruction. So, yes, authority is a question of judgment, but a big part of that judgment is the judgment of where we place our hopes and where what figures in our life we place in seats of honor, in our mental furniture again. That we put people in places of honor. In Girardian terms, these mimetic figures who can turn into mimetic rivals. So this speech given before World War I by Winston Churchill is highly suggestive of a kind of mimetic rivalry between England and Germany over the question of naval dominance. That both the Soviet horror and the Nazi horror take place in the aftermath of the horror of World War I, and are made possible by that horror, which predates them and which is more mystifying because there's not really a clear evil figure. There's not an Oedipus figure. There's not a scapegoat figure in the history of World War I. It's when you sit down and you study World War I a little bit, you're presented with this game of monopoly, this game of risk between the world powers, and by and large, there's just this overriding kind of arrogance and pride and innocence, naivete, feeding logs and sort of piling up this pile of kindling, and being sprinkled with gunpowder, just waiting for it all to ignite. So that's the Girardian piece, the idea of mimetic rivalry, that animosity builds up over time like so much kindling in a pit, like so much dynamite stacked on top of itself. So, I don't exactly have my finger on the pulse of the current situation and where we might be with respect to that, but one of the big current trends, and something that Timothy Schneider closes on in his lecture, is the idea of ecology, and not just ecology in the sense of kind of like save the earth kind of way. I mean, but the idea that ecological concerns, when they manifest themselves concretely as hunger, as want, can quickly fire up the imaginations and intellects of people in a not so angelic way. That Hitler was a thinker. He was a paranoid thinker, but he drew certain conclusions intellectually based on his own set of givens and based on his idea of ecology. And Timothy Schneider concludes rather blackly that we have not learned any kind of great lesson from World War II. Despite our efforts to commemorate it, we have not really learned the central lesson, and we are perhaps incapable of learning it, because it hits at this spiritual level of need and want and hunger. That give us this day our daily bread. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That it hits us at that level, that spiritual level, that we need our daily bread, and if we don't get our daily bread, if we don't have our cheeseburger in paradise, we are there's no telling quite what kind of crazy conspiratorial things can occur to us and take shape in human form and disrupt the delicate fabric of authority, which holds us down like an angry convict might be held by thread. You've got you've got Caliban from The Tempest being held down by Prospero, by this delicate, gauzy surface. And so, as much as it might be fun to intellectualize it, at some level you have to realize that this stuff is taking place according to the plan of God, and that plan involves apocalypse and disaster, but it also involves ultimate salvation at the end. That they will be eating and drinking and giving each other in marriage when the Son of Man comes. So, so I don't know what to say about any of that, but I like this idea of attitude, and Jack Vance and whatever. word I like better maybe is stance. What's your stance? Your stance toward the world. I might end up sharing some more videos I had made in the past. Try to analyze them a little bit. I look with sort of trepidation at my previous artistic output. I wonder what it all means. Most of it was undertaken in a kind of period of trance, more or less. I'm tempted just to end the video right now, and if you want to stop watching, understand. After all, I'm putting out these fairly long videos now every day. I don't necessarily expect everyone to listen to them all the way through, but it's nice for me. It's nice for me to just sort of let it ride. Let my tongue do its thing. To return to a dead horse, and to beat it a little bit more Nietzsche style, Horse of Turin style. Beat this baby back a little bit. Jordan Peterson, of course, rose to fame through YouTube and has popularized this idea of new media, and that we can speak now at great length, and there's a public appetite, more and more so, to listen to long-form content. That mainstream media previously had us in its thrall, and had us convinced more or less that the average person had no attention span for anything longer than 5 or 10 minutes, which has and continues to hamper public discourse when people really, even in this ant-hive society of ours, maybe largely because of this ant-hive society of ours, because we propel ourselves in these cars, in these Gary Newman cars, have these, precisely because things have broken down and become atomized, we now have this vacuum of time in which we can propel ourselves and listen to ourselves at greater length. There's always a solitude. There's a sense when it comes to the issue of food and fasting that health is sickness and sickness is health. The yin is the yang, because when people fast, even if they do it involuntarily, the form of famine, it greatly empowers the mind. There are amazing stories of prisoners of war mastering a whole language in a matter of a few weeks, because the mind is capable of great power when it goes into a state of prolonged fasting. Of course, Jesus, when he first receives the Holy Spirit, runs into the mountains and fasts for 40 days and is tempted by Satan, but he's also, you're both tempted, when you fast, you're both tempted by Satan, and if you resist the temptations of Satan, you are given the bread of angels. You can discourse with angels. And a lot of that might depend on your attitude and on your stance. And, Hitler, it seems, underwent great famine and fasting, and seems to have been tempted by the devil and to have succumbed. Whereas Christ, heard the 3 temptations of the devil. It's a very interesting passage in Scripture to analyze, and maybe I'll make a video at some point doing so. because that passage is the whole of the gospel in a certain way. If you just read that passage and meditate on it, you have the entire gospel in a certain way. Because the devil hits from these various angles, and it's a fractured kind of thing that Jesus presents a unified response to. Again, he has himself in harmony. His internal community is working in sync, and he responds point for point out of the book of Deuteronomy. So illness, fasting is strength, and a certain weakness is strength. Strength can be a weakness. So these things are all yinny and yangy. So Jordan Peterson has this idea of oratory returning. There's a kind of the internet, even though it's horrible, is a kind of sickness, a kind of forced isolation, and fasting also presents an opportunity. That if we can resist the temptations of the evil one, we can break our bread with angels. And become residents and citizens of a heavenly Jerusalem. That in Girardian terms, or maybe this is Heidegger a little bit, as the saving power, as the destructive power grows, so does the power to save. It's exactly because we have the capability of total destruction, total nuclear annihilation, that finally humanity also may have the possibility of lasting peace. Because the threat has grown so dire that if you were to engage in it, it would mean suicide. The stakes get higher, like in a poker game. The history of the world proceeds a little like a poker game, in which you bet, smaller players drop out, nation rises against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and eventually you're just sort of left there with 2 or 3 players, and you have to go all in. So I see a kind of hope with this whole thing that's taking place on YouTube and the internet. It's just a little sprout right now through cracked concrete, but I'd like to fertilize it and see if it can grow. All right, that's it.